Today we're starting Unit 4. Unit 4 will focus on the 1920s. Today's notes are post-war havoc, so we're looking at how the U.S. is transitioning after World War I, what are some of the lingering effects, and how the country is adjusting. So the 1920s was a decade of dramatic social change that forever revolutionized modern American society. Today we'll be looking at the Red Scare, the Nativist Revival, Prohibition, and Fundamentalism. Let's begin with the Red Scare. So anti-communism and anarchy. So World War I caused Americans to favor isolationism and nativism. So we began to look more inward. We didn't want to be involved with foreign affairs, other countries. We wanted to kind of focus on America first. So we're in some ways becoming more anti-immigrant, and so that's where those nativist feelings rise up. We had talked about nativism back in Unit 2, and so it just means people that are in favor of native-born Americans. So not Native Americans, not Indians, but white Americans that are born here. They want to make sure jobs are going to Native Americans, white Americans. They don't like outside influences in our country. And so Americans wanted to stay out of world affairs. They distrusted foreigners. Many worried that communism would spread to the U.S. and overthrow our government. So during World War I, Russia went through the Bolshevik Revolution. And so because of the Bolshevik Revolution, they stepped out of World War I right before we entered the war. And so with this Bolshevik Revolution, it completely toppled the Russian government. It killed the royal family of Russia. And so people began to associate communism with this bloody takeover. And so it really gets a bad reputation. So if you think about what communism means, it's communal, it's community. People should be equal. There is no personal property. People share. It's a very kind of idealistic viewpoint. However, in the way that communism has been put into practice that we've seen with the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, it is usually associated with a dictator. But when you go to just the basic principles and idea of communism, that's not what it's supposed to be. So communism gets a bad rap. Communism is basically the opposite of capitalism, of what the U.S. stands for. And so people, rightly so, see communism as a threat, because if communism were to come to our country, then it would change all of these ideals in terms of democracy and capitalism from what people have done here. So politicians are worried, big businessmen are worried, and so people fear the ideas of communism. But still, some people are interested in it. So a U.S. Communist Party does form. Many panic over this possible red plot. They assume that just because you're a communist, you're going to want to cause destruction and overthrow. There's also kind of new ideas of anarchy, and these are people that just want to do away with government completely. So we see anarchists begin to mail bombs to important officials, and so the government has to respond to that. So it's just kind of a turbulent time in the U.S. So rooting out the danger. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer went after this threat. He saw potential communists, anarchists as threat to our country, to our government, and so they wanted to kind of weed out those threats before anything could happen to the U.S., like the Bolshevik Revolution. So he began the Palmer raids. So Palmer and other federal authorities would hunt down suspected Reds, communists, and anarchists. So this could be people that read communist literature, attended a communist political meeting, or maybe they were just immigrants. So these people were often jailed. Some of them were deported. Many of these raids violated people's legal rights, and ultimately they failed to find any evidence of any plots. So what we really see happening here is just this overwhelming paranoia to foreigners, and it kind of changes people's perspectives. And that leads us to the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. And so these are two Italian immigrants. They're also known anarchists, so they have these radical political ideals, and they end up getting charged with murder, but there isn't a lot of evidence against them. It's mostly circumstantial. So they were both seen at the crime. It was a armed robbery and then a murder during the robbery. They were seen at the scene of the crime prior to it happening. They owned a car that was similar to the one used in the car at the crime. So there was no smoking gun. There was no the gun that was used in the crime was theirs, but there was a lot of circumstantial evidence. So during the trial, they focused more on the fact that they were immigrants, that they had these radical anarchist political ideas, and so their trial focused more on their ideas, who they were, and not on actual evidence of the crime. So they were both convicted. It caused a lot of outrage, not just in our country, but worldwide. And then they were also executed. So it's, again, the trial did not focus on the actual crime, but more on who they were. And people felt that was unfair and unjust, but it's an example of how the jury got whipped up in this Red Scare paranoia. Next, let's look at the Nativist Revival. So America for Americans. The Nativist movement resurged in post-war America. Americans saw immigrants as a threat to the workforce in society. They saw immigrants coming in because they were so desperate to work and to find jobs, find a place to live. They would work for less money than regular Americans would. And so if you think about strikes and the labor movement, if they are willing to unknowingly undercut what labor unions are trying to do, they are often seen as a threat to that. So the quota system. The National Origins Act of 1924 put limits on the number of immigrants from certain undesirable countries. So what it did was it based the quota on the number of people currently living in the U.S. So they would look at our current Italian population and say only 5% of that number could come in. So some immigrant groups had larger numbers, maybe bigger portion of Irish, bigger portion of English, but there were less immigrants from maybe Asian countries, Latin American countries, Eastern European countries, and so that those immigrants were limited in terms of how many of them could enter our country. And that was the purpose. We wanted to have immigrants from countries we quote-unquote liked and not from other places. So the resurgence of the KKK. KKK membership exploded as it pushed a nativist agenda and intimidated immigrants with violence. So this is a picture of KKK march in Washington, D.C. during the early 1920s. So the KKK organized itself, that was founded after the Civil War. Main target was depriving African Americans of their rights in the post-Civil War South, but they kind of died down after that. So by the early 1900s, you didn't see a lot of KKK groups, but during the 1920s, they kind of changed their motto and also became anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. And so now that they had kind of a wider array of people that they did not like and they wanted to target, they attracted more people to join them. Next up, Prohibition. So America goes dry. 1920, the 18th Amendment is enacted and alcohol is now made illegal. This law banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Prohibition was seen as a victory for the temperance movement. So we had talked about that during the Progressive era. These women felt alcohol was to blame for all of society's problems, so they had constantly been campaigning. Some states had adopted prohibition measures, but now with the 18th Amendment, this is countrywide. This is a federal law now. However, it was hugely unpopular. To help enforce the law, the Volstead Act was passed to determine what would be considered an alcoholic beverages. It was basically anything with a 0.5% of alcohol was banned. The Prohibition Bureau was underfunded, undermanned, so the law was very difficult to enforce. People could find loopholes, not necessarily loopholes, but ways around, smuggling in alcohol. So while the intention was to reduce crime, it actually created a black market for criminals to make money. So Americans break the law. Prohibition was both unpopular and easy to get around. So you had speakeasies. These were kind of secret bars. You would have to know kind of a password to get in, where they would still sell alcohol, have dancing, play music. Bootlegging, when Americans would distill their own liquor, make their own liquor, moonshine, or buy it from smugglers. So people would smuggle in liquor from Canada because it wasn't illegal there, smuggle in whiskey or scotch from Ireland and Scotland, and then organized crime. So organized crime, mafia made lots and lots of money selling liquor, organizing ways to smuggle it in and provide it to speakeasies or places that still wanted to have alcohol. Last but not least, fundamentalism. Change and tradition clash. So Christian fundamentalism emerged during the 1920s. The movement believed in a strict, literal interpretation of the Bible. Fundamentalists resisted modern change and science. They reinforced Christian morals. So controversially, they also denied Darwin's theory of evolution. With the theory of evolution, stated that everything came from one cell. Species evolved over time. They felt that was in conflict with what the Bible said, that God created man, God created everything. So they felt the theory that man evolved from apes was blasphemous because the Bible stated that God created man. In 1925, Tennessee made it illegal to teach evolution. So John T. Scopes, he's pictured with the glasses, was a high school biology teacher and decided to try to challenge the law. So he taught evolution to his students. He gets charged with teaching it, so it becomes this whole trial. So that's where the name gets its name, the Scopes trial, because John Scopes was on trial. So Scopes is defended by Clarence Darrow of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and basically their defense is, First Amendment. It's his First Amendment right to say what he wants. You can't deny him that. William Jennings Bryan is the prosecutor in the case. He's trying to prove that Scopes is guilty. William Jennings Bryan ran for president 3 times as a populist, so he's kind of a well-known figure during the 1920s. The case became a symbol of the clash between modern and traditional religion and science in the Roaring Twenties. And so what we really see happening in the 1920s is a huge change where America is becoming more modern, using more technology. You begin to see electricity becoming widespread. So we have a lot of these conflicts of old versus new, modern versus traditional clashes happening. So with this case, Scopes was found guilty, and he was going to have to pay like a $100 fine. But through some kind of technicality that happened, he was not charged, and so the decision was overturned. So nothing happened because of it. But Tennessee kept that law on the books, I believe, until the 1960s. So we are done with the notes today. Make sure you go through, finish your handout, write your summary, look through new key terms that we may have covered in the notes today.